ignored me at Christmas dinner." Then the family lawyer walked through the door. Diane Coursey had been married into the Whitfield family for 6 years, and in 6 years of Christmas dinners, she had never once been asked a single question about her life. Not about her work in the ER at St. Augustine Medical, not about the 80-hour weeks, not about anything. That Christmas, the Whitfields outdid themselves. An entire table of conversation that moved around her like she was a centerpiece nobody had asked for. Her husband Adam said nothing, the way he always said nothing. Diane smiled, passed the rolls, and told herself this was the last one. What none of them knew, not Adam, not his parents, not the cousins who'd spent the meal discussing a family asset realignment in low voices like she couldn't hear them, was that the family's longtime attorney, a quiet man named Walter Pruitt, had been trying to reach Diane directly for 3 weeks about a matter the Whitfields had been actively trying to keep from her. He finally found her, in person, the night after Christmas. And what he carried with him would change which Whitfield actually controlled the family's fortune. The Whitfield family dining room had a chandelier that Margaret liked to say had come from an estate sale in Connecticut, though Diane had heard 3 different versions of where it actually came from over 6 years of Christmas dinners. 12 feet of mahogany table, white linen pressed sharp enough to cut paper, and place settings that rotated every year according to a hierarchy Diane had never fully decoded, but had certainly learned to recognize the bottom of. She sat between Adam and his cousin Felicity, across from an empty chair that had been set for Carl's wife, who'd had the good sense to catch a cold this year. "The Aspen property needs work before spring," Harold was saying, somewhere down the table, to Carl. "Your mother wants the east wing redone before the 4th. "I told the contractor we're not doing it piecemeal this time," Carl said. "We do it once properly or we don't do it." "Properly costs money," Margaret said, in the particular tone she used when she wanted someone to defend a decision she'd already made. Diane passed the rolls to Felicity, who took one without looking up from her phone. This was how it went. 6 years of dinners where the conversation moved around the table like weather, touching everyone except her, as though she were furniture that happened to also need feeding. She had stopped expecting anyone to ask about the ER, about the overnight shifts, about the 16-year-old she'd intubated 3 nights ago, who was going to walk out of the hospital because Diane hadn't let herself blink for 4 minutes straight. She had stopped expecting Adam to mention any of it either, though some small, stubborn part of her kept waiting anyway, the way you keep checking a phone you know hasn't buzzed. "There's a realignment happening with the holding structure," Harold said, his voice dropping slightly, the way it did when he wanted a conversation to seem more private than the volume actually allowed. "Walter's drawing up the paperwork now. We want it done before tax season." "Does Diane need to—" Adam started, and Diane felt something in her chest lift slightly, just slightly, at the sound of her name in his mouth. "It's a family matter," Margaret said, smiling at Diane in the specific way she smiled when she meant the opposite of warmth. "Nothing that concerns the in-laws, dear. Just paperwork." Adam didn't finish his sentence. He picked up his wine instead. Diane looked at her plate. 6 years. And she'd learned exactly how long that particular silence lasted before someone changed the subject to something safer. Usually weather, sometimes Aspen. "It's supposed to snow in the mountains this weekend," Felicity said, finally looking up from her phone. There it was. She thought, not for the first time, about the first Christmas she'd spent at this table 6 years ago, nervous and hopeful in a dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion, certain that 6 months of dating Adam quietly and a year of being engaged had earned her at least the courtesy of curiosity. Nobody had asked her anything that first year either. She'd told herself it was nerves on everyone's part, a family still getting used to a new addition. By the 3rd Christmas, she'd stopped making excuses for them. By the 5th, she'd stopped expecting anything different, which she had once mistaken for peace. Carl leaned toward his father, lowering his voice further, though not far enough that Diane couldn't still catch fragments. "Consolidate, before the lenders ask. Walter doesn't need to draft this one words that meant nothing to her in the moment and everything in retrospect, weeks later, when she finally understood what she'd overheard." She didn't say anything in the car. Adam drove with both hands on the wheel, the way he always did after dinners like this. like the silence between them was something that needed careful steering. "You okay?" he asked eventually, somewhere past the second highway exit. "I'm fine." "They don't mean anything by it." Diane watched the streetlights slide across the windshield, evenly spaced, predictable. "I know they don't mean anything by it, Adam. That's actually the part that bothers me." She kept her voice level, the way she kept her voice level with frightened patients, with grieving families, with every difficult conversation she'd learned to survive by staying calm. If they meant something by it, at least it would be a choice. "This is just, I don't register. I haven't registered in 6 years." Adam was quiet for a long moment. "I should have said something tonight." "You started to." "I know." His jaw tightened. "I'll talk to them." She'd heard that sentence before, in different years, in different kitchens. She didn't say so. She just watched the road and thought, not for the first time, about how much of her life had become this particular kind of waiting. The drive home took 11 minutes longer than usual because of weather coming down out of the foothills, the first thin snow of the season catching in the headlights like static. Diane watched it without really seeing it, running the dinner backward in her mind the way she sometimes ran a difficult shift backward afterward. Looking for the moment she should have said something different, done something different, and finding, as always, that the moment had never really existed. There hadn't been an opening. There never was. That was the particular cruelty of it, not an insult sharp enough to object to, just an absence, repeated until it became furniture. The house was dark when they got home, the porch light Adam always forgot to leave on. Diane was halfway up the front steps, keys already out, when she heard footsteps behind them on the walkway, slow, deliberate. A man not trying to surprise anyone, but also not announcing himself loudly. "Mrs. Coursey." The voice was older, careful. "I apologize for the hour. I'm Walter Pruitt. I've been the Whitfield family's attorney for almost 30 years. Diane turned, keys still in her hand. Adam went very still beside her. "I tried your office twice this month, and your cell once," Walter said, holding up a leather folder, like an explanation in itself. "I think it's time we talked about something that frankly should have come to you years ago." Chapter 2. The 1991 Trust. Walter Pruitt sat at their kitchen table with the posture of a man who'd spent 4 decades in rooms where posture mattered. His folder closed in front of him like he wasn't sure yet whether tonight was the night to open it. "Before I say anything else," he said, "I need you to understand that I am telling you this because I believe I should have told you 6 years ago, and the fact that I didn't is something I've come to regret, not because anyone instructed me to withhold it. Because I assumed someone in the family had already explained it, and I never confirmed that they had." "Explained what?" Adam asked. He'd taken the chair across from Walter, his coat still on, like part of him hadn't decided whether this conversation was actually happening in his house. Walter opened the folder. "Your grandfather, Otto Whitfield, wrote the original family trust in 1991, 2 years before he passed. I drafted it myself, fresh out of my partnership, and your grandfather was very specific about certain provisions. He was not, if I can say so plainly, entirely comfortable with how his son and daughter-in-law treated people outside the family. He'd watched it happen with business partners, with employees, and he told me directly he didn't want it happening inside the family structure he was leaving behind." Diane felt something tighten in her stomach, the particular feeling of a conversation about to become bigger than the room it was happening in. "There's a provision in the original trust," Walter continued, "protecting the standing of any spouse married into the family for 5 years or longer. It grants that spouse a formal beneficiary interest and a voice in any major restructuring of the trust's holdings, specifically to prevent exactly what tends to happen in families like this one, where an in-law gets quietly written out of decisions that affect their own household." "I've been married to Adam for 6 years, Diane said slowly. "Yes," Walter said, "which means, under the original 1991 language, you've held protected beneficiary standing for over a year. Nobody has told you that. I don't believe Harold or Margaret have told Adam that either. though I can't say for certain what Adam does or doesn't know. Adam looked for the first time that night genuinely alarmed. I didn't know that. I swear to God, Diane, I didn't know that. Diane believed him. That wasn't the part that bothered her. She studied Walter's face instead, the careful, tired lines of a man who'd clearly rehearsed this conversation more than once on the drive over, deciding how much to say and in what order. There was something almost apologetic in the way he held himself, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis he wished he'd caught sooner. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Why tonight?" Walter's expression shifted, something careful giving way to something more direct. "Because your father-in-law called me 3 weeks ago to begin drafting a restructuring of the holding trust, what he's calling a realignment. And in the draft language his son Carl has been pushing me toward, the protected spousal provision has been quietly omitted, not amended, omitted as though it never existed." He paused. "I practiced law a long time, Mrs. Coursey. I know the difference between an oversight and a decision." Diane called Renee the next morning, sitting in the hospital cafeteria with a coffee she wasn't drinking, the fluorescent lights doing nothing for the headache she'd had since the night before. "Say that again," Renee said, slowly. "There's apparently a provision from 1991 that makes me some kind of protected beneficiary in the Whitfield Trust, and the family's lawyer thinks they're trying to write me out of it before I find out it exists." Renee was quiet for a second, which for Renee was unusual. "Diane, I've told you for 6 years that family treats you like the help. I didn't realize they were also treating you like a legal liability." "I don't even know what it means yet." Walter's pulling the actual language. "What does Adam say?" Diane turned her coffee cup slowly on the table. "Adam says he didn't know." "Do you believe him?" "I do. That's almost the worst part. He didn't know because he's never once asked enough questions about his own family's business to find out." She finally took a sip of the coffee, cold now, bitter. 6 years, Renee. 6 years of feeling like a placeholder at that table, and it turns out there was paperwork the whole time saying I wasn't supposed to be invisible. Nobody just bothered to tell me. So what happens now? Walter's pulling everything, the original trust, whatever amendments exist, all of it. Diane pushed the coffee away, finally admitting to herself she wasn't going to drink it. "I keep thinking about every dinner I sat through, telling myself it didn't matter. If I'd known 6 years ago that there was a legal document somewhere saying I mattered, would I have sat through it differently? Would I have said something sooner? Would it have mattered if you had?" Diane didn't have an answer for that yet. It was the question she kept turning over on her drive home, in the gaps between patients. In the quiet of the on-call room at 2 in the morning, not whether the Whitfields owed her an apology, but whether 6 years of silence had cost her something she couldn't easily get back, paperwork or no paperwork. Walter sent the documents 2 days later, copies of the original 1991 trust, scanned and notarized, along with something Diane hadn't expected. A 1-page amendment, also notarized, dated 6 years ago. The same year she'd married Adam. She read it twice at her kitchen table before she understood what she was looking at. The amendment didn't strike the spousal protection clause. It couldn't. Otto's original trust required unanimous family consent to alter that specific provision, consent that had clearly never been obtained. Instead, the amendment quietly redefined active beneficiary in a separate section. The kind of small definitional change that looked harmless unless you understood exactly how it would later be used to argue the spousal clause no longer applied to current restructuring votes. It was clever. It was also, Diane thought, 6 years old, drafted and notarized within months of her wedding, as though someone had wanted the loophole ready and waiting, just in case. She stared at the signature line, Margaret Whitfield's signature, witnessed by an attorney whose name she didn't recognize. Not Walter's. They hadn't used the family lawyer for this one. Chapter 3. The Realignment. Diane didn't confront anyone right away. She'd learned that lesson 100 times over in the ER. The worst thing you can do in a crisis is move before you understand exactly what you're dealing with. So she waited, and she read, and she let Walter walk her through exactly what the trust's language meant and didn't mean, line by careful line, until she understood the structure of the thing as well as he did. What she learned in the process surprised her more than the amendment itself. Whitfield Logistics was not the company its Christmas dinners suggested. A trucking and freight downturn 2 years earlier, combined with an expensive and poorly timed warehouse expansion Carl had pushed through over Harold's quiet objections, had left the company carrying debt the family had kept almost entirely private. The realignment Harold had mentioned at dinner wasn't really about taxes. It was about consolidating control of the trust's most liquid assets before the company's lenders started asking harder questions, and before any outside beneficiary, like Diane, could object to how those assets got reallocated. "They're not trying to hurt me specifically," Diane said to Walter, the week before the family's planned restructuring meeting. "I don't think I even occurred to them as a threat. I think I occurred to them as an inconvenience they'd already quietly solved 6 years ago." "That may be true," Walter said. "It doesn't make the amendment any less invalid. Unanimous consent was never obtained. Adam didn't sign it. You certainly didn't sign it. As far as I'm concerned, as the trust's drafting attorney of record, that amendment doesn't hold up." "Then why didn't you say something 6 years ago?" Walter's expression was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Because they didn't use me to draft it, Mrs. Coursey. They used someone else, specifically so I wouldn't know it existed until it mattered. I only found it because Carl, in his hurry to finalize this realignment, asked me to reference an amendment I had no record of drafting. I asked questions. That's the only reason any of us are having this conversation." He spread the company's financial summaries across Diane's kitchen table, the ones his forensic accountant had quietly pulled together over the past 2 weeks. "I want you to understand what you're actually walking into, not just the legal standing, but the reality underneath it. Whitfield Logistics carries $41 million in debt against assets that, charitably valued, cover perhaps 60% of that. The warehouse expansion Carl pushed through was financed against the trust's liquid holdings, the same holdings that spousal protection clause gives you a voice over." Diane studied the numbers slowly, the way she'd once studied anatomy diagrams, looking for the thing that didn't fit. "So, if I have a voice in how those holdings get reallocated, and the holdings are what's actually keeping the company solvent, then you have considerably more leverage than anyone in that family currently believes you have," Walter finished. "Which is precisely why I think they tried to remove your standing before anyone told you it existed. I don't believe Margaret understood the technical depth of what she was doing. I believe she understood the outcome she wanted and found someone willing to get her there." Adam found her in the kitchen the night before the family meeting, going through the documents again, the same pages she'd read a dozen times already. "I talked to my dad," he said. "Told him I knew about the spousal clause. Told him I knew about the amendment." Diane looked up. "What did he say?" "He said it was a technical matter handled by professionals and that I was overreacting." Adam pulled out the chair across from her, sat down slowly. "And then I asked him directly if Mom signed something 6 years ago intentionally designed to write you out of the family's legal structure before anyone told you it existed. And he didn't answer me. He just said we'd discuss it as a family." "What did you say?" "I said there wasn't going to be a family discussion that didn't include you sitting at the table as an actual participant, not a placeholder, not someone we talk around." He met her eyes, and for once, he didn't look away first. "I should have said that years ago, Diane. About 100 different dinners ago. I'm sorry it took paperwork to make me say it now instead of just noticing." Diane didn't answer right away. 6 years of silences had taught her exactly how much weight a single sentence could carry, and exactly how easily that weight could turn out to be temporary. "I believe you mean it," she said finally. "I need you to still mean it in March, Adam, not just this week." "I know. I'm serious. This isn't a one-time apology problem." "I know," he said again, quieter. "I'm done assuming things will sort themselves out if I just don't say anything uncomfortable." The family meeting was held in Harold's study, the room with the good scotch and the leather chairs and the portrait of Otto Whitfield above the fireplace. watching everything with an expression Diane had never quite been able to read until now. Carl had brought a folder of his own, thick with restructuring language he clearly expected to walk through unopposed. Margaret sat near the fire, composed, the way she was always composed, as though composure itself were a kind of argument. Outside, the same thin snow that had followed Diane home from Christmas dinner was falling again, catching the porch light in slow, deliberate spirals. The kind of weather that made the whole house feel sealed off from anything beyond its own walls. "We appreciate everyone making time," Harold began. "This realignment protects the company and the family's long-term position. Carl's prepared the documents. We should be able to finalize today." The study door opened before anyone could respond. Walter Pruitt stepped inside, his leather folder under his arm, and behind him, still in her coat, was Diane. Chapter 4. What the trust actually says. Nobody spoke for a moment. Carl's hand, Diane noticed, had gone still on top of his folder, the way a hand goes still right before someone realizes the floor isn't where they thought it was. "Walter," Harold said carefully, "this is a family meeting." "It is," Walter agreed, setting his folder down on Harold's desk without being asked. "Which is precisely why I'm here and why Mrs. Coursey is here. Under the original 1991 trust drafted by your father, she holds protected beneficiary standing as a spouse of more than 5 years. That standing entitles her to participate directly in any vote restructuring the trust's holdings. I'd be failing my professional obligation to your father's intentions if I allowed this meeting to proceed without her." "There was an amendment," Carl said quickly. "The active beneficiary definition was updated years ago." "There was a document," Walter said, his voice even. "It was never validly executed. Unanimous family consent is required to alter that specific provision under the original trust language, and I have confirmed in writing that Adam Whitfield never signed it, nor did Diane Coursey, nor, as it happens, did Harold." He looked at Margaret. "Only one signature appears on that amendment, and it wasn't drafted by my office, which is the only reason it took this long for anyone to notice." Margaret's composure didn't break exactly. It simply stopped being useful. "I was protecting this family's stability," she said. "Otto wrote that trust before he understood how complicated things would become. I made a judgment call." "You made a unilateral one," Walter said, "which is not the same thing, legally or otherwise." Harold looked, for the first time in Diane's 6 years of knowing him, genuinely uncertain. "Margaret, you told me Walter had reviewed that amendment." "I told you it had been handled," Margaret said, and something in her voice cracked slightly. Not from guilt exactly, but from the particular exhaustion of a long-running performance, finally meeting an audience that wasn't playing along. Diane hadn't planned to speak. She'd told herself, on the drive over, that she would let Walter handle the legal architecture of it and simply be present, a body in the room, finally, instead of an absence. But something in the silence that followed made her say it anyway. "I'm not here to take anything from this family," she said. "I don't want the company. I don't want control of the trust. I want what your father apparently already decided I was entitled to, 6 years before anyone bothered telling me it existed." She looked at Margaret, then Harold, then last, at Adam. "I want to stop being someone you plan around instead of someone you talk to." Carl, recovering some of his composure, tried one more angle. "This changes nothing about the company's financial position. We still need this realignment to manage the debt load." "Then manage it honestly," Diane said, "with everyone who has standing actually in the room. I'm not going to block a restructuring that genuinely protects this company. I am going to insist it happens with my voice included, the way your grandfather intended, instead of around me, the way it's been done for 6 years." The restructuring happened over the following month, slower than Carl wanted and more thoroughly than Harold expected, with Diane's voice in every major decision, not dominating it, just present, the way Otto Whitfield had apparently always meant for it to be. The debt got addressed honestly instead of quietly. The warehouse expansion got scaled back to something the company could actually sustain. Margaret never apologized directly, though she did, eventually, start asking Diane actual questions at dinner, small ones, tentative ones, about the ER, about her work, as though she were relearning a language she'd simply decided years ago wasn't worth speaking. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. Diane wasn't sure forgiveness was the right word for any of it. It was something closer to a corrected record. 6 years of being unseen, finally written down somewhere that mattered, even if it had taken her grandfather-in-law's foresight and a misplaced signature to make it visible. Walter retired quietly that spring, handing the trust's ongoing administration to a younger associate but staying on, at Diane's specific request, as an advisor on anything touching the spousal protection clause. "Your grandfather-in-law would have liked you," he told her, the last time she saw him in his office, boxes half-packed around him. "He always said the measure of a family wasn't how it treated the people born into it. It was how it treated the people who chose to join it anyway." She and Adam talked more in that month than they had in the 2 years before it. Slow, sometimes difficult conversations at their own kitchen table about all the dinners where he'd said nothing, all the moments he'd let pass because disagreeing with his parents had always felt more costly than the silence. "I keep thinking about how long I would have stayed invisible," Diane told him one night, "if Walter hadn't found that signature." "I keep thinking about that too," Adam said. "I don't have a good answer for it." "You don't need a good answer. You need a different habit." She reached across the table, not as an ending to the conversation, but as a continuation of it. "Starting with actually finishing your sentences at dinner." He almost laughed, the sound catching somewhere between guilt and relief. "I can do that." "I know," she said. "I'm going to hold you to it." The following Christmas, the Whitfield dining room looked the same. The chandelier, the white linen, the place settings that still followed some hierarchy Diane suspected she'd never fully decode. But when Harold mentioned a decision about the company's expansion plans, he looked directly at her and asked what she thought. It wasn't a grand gesture. Nobody made a speech about it. Diane simply answered the question plainly, the way she would have answered it 6 years earlier if anyone had thought to ask. She had spent 6 years learning to survive being unseen. She hadn't expected that the thing that finally changed it wouldn't be an argument or an ultimatum, but a piece of paper her husband's grandfather had written decades before. Either of them was anything to each other at all proof, finally, that someone in that family had seen her coming and had tried, in his own quiet way, to make